Welcome back to the latest season of What Your GP Doesn't Tell You, a podcast for both doctors and patients with me, Liz Tucker. I'm delighted to say that while the podcast was taking a break, it was selected as a finalist in the Independent Podcast Awards. So really lovely to get that recognition. And I wanted to say huge thanks to all my financial supporters, contributors and listeners that make this podcast possible. Thanks so much. In this week's podcast, I'm talking to Dr Kat Toups, who I met recently at the Integrative and Personalised Medicine Congress in London. She, along with a group of other researchers, argues we need to completely rethink our understanding of dementia, that it's a mistake to think it's an untreatable disease, and that certainly in its early stages, it's reversible. MRI scans of patients that Kat's treated have shown significant improvements to the extent that some have even been able to go back to work following treatment. She says the error has been to think of dementia as having one root cause, that is actually a multi-system disease. If she's right, that means a single magic bullet pharmaceutical solution is never going to work. We discuss Kat's treatment protocol in some detail, including diet, exercise, brain training, testing for toxins and infections, and hormones. And I've added a link in the podcast show notes to a guide she's written outlining her approach. I wanted to make sure we covered all the key elements in our conversation, so as a result, the podcast is a little longer than normal. And many apologies for my voice during our conversation. As you'll hear, I was struggling with a virus. But before we get to Kat's interview, a brief request from me. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to leave a review on Spotify or Apple, that would be much appreciated. It really helps. You can also become a paid supporter of the podcast at patreon.com/whatyourgpdoesn'ttellyu or via PayPal on my website, whatyourgpdoesn'ttellyu.com. A huge amount of work goes into both the research and production of this podcast, so even a small amount of money makes a huge difference. And you can find out more information about the pod on my website, where you can sign up for the podcast mailing list, follow me on Twitter at Liz C. Tucker, and on my Substack account, liz.tucker.substack.com. Many thanks. And now back to Kat's interview. Dr Kat Toups is a functional medicine psychiatrist treating cognitive impairment and dementia. She's board certified by the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology, a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, which is the highest honour bestowed by the APA, and a certified practitioner with the Institute for Functional Medicine. Here's Kat's interview. Well, Kat, thank you so much for joining the podcast today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
I think, Kat, when a lot of people hear the word dementia, they think of a disease that is untreatable, but you firmly believe that, in fact, it is treatable.
Yes, an important message that I hope people will take away from our talk, that dementia is not a death sentence, as we have all been taught to believe. And anytime people get this diagnosis of dementia, it just strikes fear in our hearts. I mean, it's something we're all deathly afraid of. But what we've come to learn, both through clinical work and through the clinical trials research that I do, is that dementia happens for reasons. It's not just this mysterious disease that happens just because of people's genetics. There's all kinds of underlying reasons that contribute to the degeneration in our brains. So if we can search out and find all the reasons that are contributing and then work on fixing all of those things, we can stop the degeneration from happening. And then there's a corollary to that. Of course, we have this amazing capacity of our brain called neuroplasticity, and our brains have the ability to still make new synaptic connections up until the time of our death in a very old age. We're still making new connections in the brain. So we can employ various different methods to help regenerate things if we can get people before the dementia is too far gone.
It's interesting you're talking about causes rather than cause.
Yeah.
Because I think some people think, is there a single magic bullet?
Yeah.
And what you're saying is there are a number of underlying causes that need to be looked at. It's not just one thing.
Exactly. It's a great point. And I think this is the problem that we have with the kind of reductionistic thinking that a medication is going to stop this. And of course, all of the trials with the medications that are out there on the market are pretty dismal, in my opinion. We have, some drugs now that can slow things down for 6 months, but certainly don't stop or reverse the disease. And of course, they have very high incidence of side effects, like 24% risk of having brain bleeds from the medication. So single medication results, they haven't worked. Before I was practicing functional medicine, I ran a clinical trials research center for 14 years. I've done over 100 pharmaceutical trials and did clinical trials with many, many of the Alzheimer's medications that are on the market until this newer generation. And none of them work. Even 15 years ago, I remember one of the trials I did, we had a medication that could wipe out all the amyloid plaques, which is what people sometimes think is the be all and end all with Alzheimer's. Well, if we can get rid of these amyloid plaques, we can stop the disease. But in this particular trial, we showed that you could wipe out the plaques, but people didn't get better.
Because the conventional idea is that Alzheimer's is caused by amyloid plaques and neurofibril tangles in the brain.
Right. So those are sequelae of the brain degenerating, but they're not the cause. They're causing degeneration. But the question becomes, what is causing that to happen in the first place? So we know that amyloid is this sticky, gooey substance that's secreted by the neurons to protect them from a hostile insult. So if you have toxins in your brain, if you have infections in your brain, something causing inflammation, then the neurons can secrete this amyloid substance. And in the short term, if you have a time limited thing, then that can be protective, right? But if you have something that's chronically triggering that amyloid production, then eventually it's going to kill the neurons and just gum up all the workings in the brain. So the way I see it is that we have to figure out what's injuring the brain and get rid of those things that are injuring the brain. I call it the 3 R's: remove, replace, and regenerate. So we need to remove what's hurting it. We need to replace whatever kind of nutrients and hormones the brain needs to function optimally. And then we also need to help the brain to regenerate and employ neuroplasticity techniques to make new connections. So the search then becomes really, what's causing this in the first place? This, to me, involves a lot of testing. We have to test all kinds of things, because if you think that there's 10 things that are harming your brain and you fix 8 of them, but you still have 2, the degeneration is going to still continue. It's been well known for a couple of decades that problems with high blood sugar, diabetes, and high lipids are destructive for the brain. Some people call Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. And we know that unregulated blood sugar destroys multiple organs in our body, including our brains. So that's one cause, but I have many people whose blood sugar are fine. So that isn't the cause for everyone. Some of the things that I think people are really missing beyond the metabolic things like blood pressure, blood sugar, and high lipids are that there's a big impact of infections in the brain and toxins in the brain. And then beyond that, also the lack of hormones, because we need hormones for our brain to function optimally.
We talked about Alzheimer's, but obviously there are other forms of dementia as well. Are you looking at all forms of dementia?
Yes. So Alzheimer's is, as you said, one type of dementia, but we're learning about more and more types. I mean, when I went through my training 30 some odd years ago, we had frontotemporal dementia and Lewy body dementia and Alzheimer's dementia. And now we have so many more subtleties that the neurologists have come to understand. But I think for the purposes of trying to reverse things, it still comes back to what's causing the brain to degenerate. It may manifest as different types of dementia, but I think this is a useful approach to try to address all the types of dementia. Now, can we stop the progression with all types of dementia? No, I don't think we're there yet. And some types of dementia are much more rapidly progressing. But I have to say that my colleagues that I, work with in study groups and in my dementia trials, and I have had success with some other types of dementias besides Alzheimer's. So I think that this is a useful approach to try for any kind of brain-based disorders.
So what are the types of dementia which are harder to treat?
I think frontotemporal dementia is harder, but we've had some success in some people with frontotemporal, but not as frequently as with Alzheimer's type dementia. Some of the harder core neurologic disorders, I have a list of multiple different types of dementia, and they all seem to have 2 or 3 letter abbreviations. PSP, progressive supranuclear palsy. I mentioned Lewy body dementia, and then there's Parkinson's dementia that's closely related to Lewy body dementia, vascular dementia. And I think vascular dementia, we're learning all kinds of ways to help support vascular issues, and COVID, because it attacks the blood vessels so ubiquitously, has given us a lot more information about that.
Would it be fair to say that Alzheimer's and vascular dementia are 2 of the more common forms of the
Yeah,
disease?
I think, Alzheimer's and vascular dementia are definitely 2 of the more common forms. And I think there's a huge overlap between those 2.
So in a recent trial, which is called the Four Winds trial, you looked at 25 patients with early dementia.
Mhm.
So first of all, how did you assess their dementia? What did you look at?
We use cognitive testing and clinical history, and also corroboration from their study partner, generally, most often a spouse. To be in the trial, we actually require that you had somebody that lived with the subject to act as a study partner to help support all of the procedures that needed to happen, and also to give us another data point of how did somebody else think they were doing, were they improving or not. So we use 2 different rating scales for cognitive testing. We use the MoCA, which is the Montreal Cognitive Assessment Form, and MoCA has widely replaced the Mini Mental Status Exam for earlier Alzheimer's. So the Mini Mental Status Exam is useful when you have moderate to severe Alzheimer's. The site was done at 3 locations, 3 investigators, and we used an outside independent rater to do that testing for them. So it wasn't me testing my patients, because, of course, there can be some subjective nature to that.
Sure.
And then we use a really nice neuropsychiatric battery that's an online test called CNS Vital Signs, or CNSVS for short. And this takes about 50 minutes to do this test that runs through all kinds of domains of cognitive function, similar to neuropsych testing that would be done with a neuropsychologist. It normally takes a few hours to do. Each patient came into the office to do this testing online. We have a special keyboard, so they all use the same keyboard and did it in a standardized way. So we used those 2 markers for their cognitive improvement. And then we had a caregiver rating scale, was an interview done each time. So we measured the progress at baseline, and then 3 months, 6 months, and 9 months. It was a 9-month trial.
So did you take MRI scans?
We had an MRI at the beginning and the end of the study, and the MRI findings were some of the most exciting to me in the study. We really didn't expect in 9 months to see any significant changes in the MRIs, but in actuality, we did. What we found was that basically with normal aging, without MCI or Alzheimer's, with normal aging, your hippocampus declines in volume, and that's the memory center of our brain, is how it's often referred to. And then also the gray matter in the brain degenerates.
So basically the brain shrinks with age anyway.
Yes. What happened in our trial was that the gray matter, instead of getting smaller, actually improved. And the hippocampal volumes in our subjects did decline, but it was significantly better than the amount of decline with normal aging, and way, way better than you would see with MCI or Alzheimer's. We work with a neuroradiology professor to analyze our data. I also do something called volumetric MRI scan, which is basically a software program where they take the MRI scan in a particular way. They take additional slices when they're taking the views in the MRI. In order to use this program, we used one called NeuroQuant, and then you upload the photos to the NeuroQuant, and it gives us a volume of all the structures in the brain. And those volumes are compared to age-matched controls. The neuroradiologist has some other sophisticated programs that he's able to run our data through multiple things. But again, that was a huge shock to show that what we were doing with using a precision medicine or functional medicine approach to treat and reverse the cognitive decline actually had changes in the brain volume. So completely unexpected, and is one more measure to take out any subjective measurements that you do in a study.
And Kat, you've referred to functional medicine several times. So people
Yes.
who aren't familiar with that phrase, how would you define functional medicine?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So functional medicine is really about addressing the root causes of illness. And instead of saying, okay, you have hypertension and you take this medication, instead it's like, well, why do you have hypertension? What are the factors? Because there's multiple factors for many diseases that we treat. So functional medicine works to understand what are the causes of a disease and then uses basically a whole person approach of starting with the basics. What are you eating? Are you sleeping? What's your stress level? Are you moving your body and exercising? So those are some of the basics. And then beyond that, looking for other things, as I alluded to, like infections, toxins, hormones, nutrient levels. So basically, I just think of it as root cause resolution medicine. In the publications for our first research study, we use the title precision medicine. I think precision medicine is perhaps a little more widely known and appreciated in the medical community. And to me, they're pretty much almost the same thing. Precision medicine is finding the right treatment for the right patient and just implying that there's an individualized treatment for each person. Because I think that's the really important message here, that what I do with my patients that have cognitive decline is different for each patient. I don't follow formulas. I test all of the same things to look at potential treatment targets, but then the treatment itself is going to be individualized to what comes up with their testing and their lifestyle.
But that's interesting, isn't it, Kat? Because so much Western medicine relies on giving patients exactly the same dosage for a particular disease.
Well, and it's give the disease a name and give it a drug. That's how I was trained. I'm a psychiatrist, right? There's all kinds, psychiatric medications. And, they have depression, you give them an antidepressant. I was trained to look for thyroid disease as a mitigating factor with depression, but there are so many other factors that come into play. So the idea of pill for an ill, that is how I was trained. But after doing, as I mentioned, more than 100 clinical trials, every time I was given a new clinical trial with a new mechanism of action, I would get excited. Okay, here's a new mechanism of action. This is going to help my people with depression or schizophrenia. Yes, of course, medication can improve suffering for some people, but it didn't reverse the disease. It wasn't dealing with the underlying drivers of the disease.
You were just treating the symptoms, basically.
Exactly.
So in this trial, Kat, let's look at what you did, the changes you made that had these remarkable long-term effects on the brain. Now, one of the changes you made was to the patient's diet. What did you do?
For the purposes of our trials, we ask our patients to use a ketogenic diet and get into ketosis. Ketogenesis is shifting the body and the brain from burning sugar as a fuel to burning fat as a fuel. We know that with aging, we lose our metabolic flexibility. And so people are developing insulin resistance, and they're just losing the ability to adequately change the carbs and the sugar into the ATP and the molecules that we need to drive our bodies and our brain. And so shifting people into burning fat as a fuel for many people seems to just light up their brains and make it function more effectively. We've known for over a century that ketosis is useful for children with intractable seizures. So that was our signal that there's something happening in the brain with this state. So enter into, the work we do now in our dementia studies. We're working with older people, people with cognitive decline, but giving them the support to do a ketogenic diet. And it's been so interesting the more that I learn about it and see the benefits. I just had interviews with 3 of my study patients, and spontaneously, all 3 of them said, I love this diet. I have so much energy. I do not feel hungry. I don't crave sugar. I don't crave anything. I feel good on this diet.
And how low are you taking them in terms of carbs?
For most people, I'd say it's 30 to 50 grams. It depends how high the blood sugar is to start with. So the higher your blood sugar is, the harder it becomes to get those sugars low enough. We have our patients checking their ketone levels with the finger sticks on Keto Mojo, and we ask them to be at least in minimal ketosis with their ketone levels at 1 or higher. I think our protocol specifies 1 to 3 or 1 to 4. None of my patients are at those super high levels. Most are between 1 and 2. One of the things that I sometimes see is when they do deepen their ketosis in the beginning, they get, and I put it in quotes because of the bad English, more better. So more ketosis can actually give more tangible benefits for the brain. But people then hit a point when they get solidly in ketosis and they start gaining their metabolic flexibility again, they don't necessarily need to have as high a level. So the approach that the nutritionist that works with my patient cohort uses is she takes them very rapidly into ketosis by restricting things. And then as they start getting into ketosis, she puts them in phase 2 where they add back in a little bit of carby vegetables and maybe some blueberries as a dessert. And then phase 3 where they add in a little bit more. That approach has been working well for us.
In addition to being a ketogenic diet, there are some additional things that you ask for as well. The diet is designed to be grain-free, dairy-free, organic.
Yeah, this isn't just restricting carbs. We also, of course, look at the quality of what people are putting into their body beyond the carbs. So we ask people to eat a whole food diet, right? We want to eliminate the processed food, that's empty food. And then when you're taking away the carbs, which is a fuel source for our body, you have to replace it with the right amount of fat. So you can't just restrict carbs and not greatly increase your fat level because you'll starve. So when we have people eat fat, we also teach them to eat healthy fats. We want to put in lots of coconut oil and lots of olive oil, which is an unsaturated fat, and then nuts and seeds and free range meats and chicken, fish, those kind of things to offset the lack of carbs for people.
And Kat, why do you say no dairy or grain?
They're inflammatory. So the grains, first off, the gluten is the biggest culprit for most people, whether you're allergic to gluten or not. We know that it increases an enzyme or protein in the lining of the gut called zonulin. Whether you're allergic or not, zonulin goes up. Zonulin increases the permeability of the gut. So this is what creates a situation that people call leaky gut, which are little microscopic holes in the lining of the gut. But when you have these holes, then the food that's in your gut, as well as the bacteria, then can travel through those little microscopic pores into the bloodstream. And when we have invaders in the bloodstream, that activates inflammation to kill the invaders. And chronic inflammation is one of the problems that can destroy our health. So gluten is kind of the big thing and the big line in the sand that we like people to take out. But the rest of the grains are high in sugar. So we're trying to lower the sugar. The problem is people say, I'll eat gluten-free and I'll buy these gluten-free foods, right? I'll buy some gluten-free bread and I'll buy some gluten-free chips. And you're still putting high levels of carbs into your body with those things.
And what about dairy? Presumably some dairy is more inflammatory than others. I mean, for example, live yogurt compared to other forms.
Yes. Well, fortunately now we have some marvelous coconut yogurts that are very high in the living bacteria in the yogurts. And fermented foods, I just have to put a plug in for fermented foods because that is the best way to improve the health of our gut. Stanford did a marvelous study, I think it's been about 2 years now. They compared taking probiotics to eating healthy whole grains to eating fermented foods. And what they found was the fermented foods were the clear winners to improve the diversity of the microbiome in our gut. And what we know is the diversity of the microbiome is one of the big determinants of the health of our gut and our immune system. And I always tell people, if you don't like sauerkraut and kimchi, eat some of these good coconut yogurts. So there's an option there. But dairy is just inherently inflammatory for a lot of people. It is our second most common food allergen after gluten. Singers will avoid dairy before a singing performance because it creates a lot of mucus for them, which is kind of an allergic type reaction. So for the sake of trying to move the needle quickly and help people, that's where we've gone with our diets, is to take them off the dairy. And some people say, okay, goat's milk cheese, and it's not as antigenic or allergenic as cow dairy, but we just ask them to avoid all dairy.
And the other thing that you're strict about in this is giving an 8 to 12 hour eating period and no eating 2 to 3 hours before bed.
Yeah, we know that time restricted eating or time restricted feeding starts to induce autophagy. And autophagy is when our immune system and our blood system starts cleaning things up and taking out things that are dying and ill. And so it's rejuvenating. So we ask people first off not to eat a couple hours before bed because getting people sleep good and solid and corrected is important for our purposes of brain regeneration. We know the brain can regenerate while we are in deep sleep. So we want to make sure that people are having good sleep, deep sleep. And when you eat just before bed, then your digestive system is busy digesting the food, and it's known to impact the quality of the sleep for some people. So now not everyone can not eat before bed. Some people have low blood sugar and they just have to have a snack before bed in order to maintain their blood sugar. But most people can avoid eating a couple of hours before bed. And then we ask them to do this time restricted eating where they compress their calories in 8 to 12 hours of the day, because that also helps to deepen the ketosis. And there's very nice data for all of this intermittent fasting benefits on the immune system and the metabolic system. And what I see in the trials is in the beginning, people put their calories in 12 hours. And as they get more adapted to the diet, they'll put their feeding interval into shorter and shorter. So people will go to 10 hours and then they'll go to 8 hours. We also know that the less calories we eat, the longer we live. I mean, there's, whole new science of things happening with food and longevity. So these are not huge, hard things for people to do.
Now, you touched on sleep, Kat. What do you do to help people sleep better?
Yeah, first off, we test all our patients for sleep apnea. Some people because they're snoring and snorting and stopping breathing, but other people have more subtle forms of sleep apnea, or there's another condition called upper airway restriction syndrome, which is like a floppy airway. And I see that one more often in thin women. Often taught that sleep apnea is more common in men, which it is. And, the obstructive sleep apnea, if men are carrying their weight in their belly, they tend to have stocky, thick necks and things that can compress the airway. But I have turned up sleep apnea or upper airway restriction syndrome in thin women. So can't just use that stereotype as a guideline for everyone. So we test all of our patients. And these days, it's quite easy to get home sleep studies done. In the US here, there's a couple of companies that you can lease or purchase the devices. So I have my patients test their sleep 3 nights in a row. Sometimes I'll see 2 nights that are just fine. And then the third night will raise some alarm bells that something is not right. When you're not oxygenating your brain every single night, you're going to be killing neurons right and left. It's also quite destructive for the heart. So people will develop congestive heart failure over time with untreated sleep apnea. So we want to correct that. Beyond that, there's insomnia and not sleeping well, not getting restorative sleep. There's multiple factors with that, of course. One of the things we find is an important component of our program is exercise. When people exercise during the day, they do tend to sleep better at night.
But isn't there also an issue, Kat, that as people develop dementia, often their sleep patterns break down?
Yes, yes, they do. And of course, as the dementia gets more severe, we have sundowning where people are awake at night and more confused. So it is a factor. So in our current dementia trial, we're using an Oura ring. Do you have the Oura ring in the UK?
We do. Yeah.
Yes. So we're using the Oura ring and we're able to actually see the data. It's coming into my health coach who's able to track what's happening there for people and alert me when people are not getting right amounts of deep sleep or the right amount of total sleep. Another component of what we do, and it ties into the sleep, is working with some kind of meditative component that helps your nervous system to switch into a parasympathetic, calm, Zen-like mode. And actually, diet and exercise are the two best known ways to increase our brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF for short, that helps us to make new connections in our brain. So we want to introduce some type of meditative or mindfulness component for people that they can do on a daily basis. And that can be different things for different people, but for the purposes of the study, we pick one thing and we use HeartMath for that. HeartMath is a marvelous device that they've done wonderful research for more than 20 years. They were the first people to talk about heart rate variability because they're showing that using their methodology can improve people's heart rate variability. And when we improve the heart rate variability, that's one of the factors that can improve the sleep, ties over to general well-being as well and support for the brain. HeartMath, I call that meditation for non-meditators. And basically, you have a device that you clip onto your ear and plug it into your cell phone, and it's measuring your heart rate variability, not just your heart rate. The heart rate variability is the variability between each beat. And there's a certain patterning with heart rate variability that is good, and there's certain patterning that is bad. So they find that when you synchronize your breathing with the heart rate, then you can improve the heart rate variability. So the little device pretty much tells you to breathe in and breathe out, and it's synchronizing that with your heartbeats. And then there's another component besides the breathing, and they tell you to think of someone you love. And that's such a fun thing for me when I play with this device. It would show me I was in the red zone when I started. And then as soon as I started the breathing, I would go into the blue zone. And then when I thought of someone I loved, that would take me into the green zone. And so when we think of someone we love, they say, think of this as a heart-focused meditation. Think of breathing in and out through your heart and think of someone or someplace or something that you love. And those feelings of love just flood our body with wonderful hormones like oxytocin that can then help our nervous system to downregulate.
So it's a pretty good example of the mind-body connection.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, Kat, you touched on exercise helping people sleep. What exercise do you recommend for these patients?
Again, that can be individualized, but the programs that we recommend are a combination of aerobic type exercise, and we include high intensity interval training, or HIIT, and then also muscular strength. So weight training, so important, especially with aging. And one of the things that we've learned now is that one of the biggest predictors of longevity is the strength of our muscles. And then we also work with people on their balance, because balance is one of those things that goes south with aging. And of course, it is related to your muscular strength. If you keep your core strength strong, then you're going to have better balance. Of course, and help to prevent things like falls where people break a hip and die within 6 to 12 months. So the high intensity interval training, we have people do that twice a week, maybe 3 times at most, but the data is quite robust to just do 5 to 10 minutes of high intensity interval training twice a week can change your lipids, your blood sugar. It changes all the metabolic markers.
It's a lot of return for potentially not that many minutes of exercise a week.
Right. 2 to 3 minutes of high intensity can change things. I tell them, like, start with 30 seconds, 20 seconds, because the high intensity component, you have to push as hard as you can think of going, to the point where you almost feel like you're going to throw up. And you cannot just start with 2 minutes of that. You've got to work up slowly. One of the benefits of my clinical trials to me has been the great support that our coaches can give the patients. So obviously this is, a dream team. We have the funding in our study for our patients to have a nutritionist, a health coach, and an exercise coach. The exercise coach has been phenomenal with our patients, because I have had patients, some of them have never exercised a day in their life. And you have to, meet our minimum requirements for everything. And that's exercise 6 days a week. So he helps people to deal with their body issues with aging. Okay, I have this bad hip and I can't do that. Finds the right programs for people and helps them to start these exercise programs safely so they don't get hurt. And they come out loving their exercise. And that's a big shift for someone who's never exercised, to turn them into an exerciser. So I would advocate, if people have access to a trainer to help them, and you don't have to see them forever, just to get your program going safely and effectively.
Is it harder, though, if you're dealing with someone who's got early dementia?
Well, early dementia, people can still exercise. We call their study partners and not caregivers. So in the early phases, there's direction that's needed, reminders that are needed, but it doesn't impair their ability to actually do things.
Now, you talked about mindfulness training, stress reduction. Is there any other form of brain training that you incorporate?
Yes, we do. Part of the neuroplasticity, we want to stimulate the brain. And as I mentioned, exercise and meditation are the two best known ways to stimulate your brain. And those are free. You don't have to pay money to do those things. The mindfulness, I tell people, go for a walk in nature, leave your cell phone, smell the smells of the plants and the flowers, and listen to the birds, and just try to turn off your mind. And that is a meditation, right? That's being mindful.
Kat, when I go for a walk, I always take a podcast with me. Is that a mistake?
Probably.
Right. Good to know.
Listen in your car while you're driving. But if you really want to get the full benefit of that lovely walk in nature.
Well, I suppose because I live in a city,
Yeah,
I don't necessarily get to walk in nature. I'm trying to exercise. And if I'm just walking through the streets, I get a bit bored. And so if I'm listening to a podcast, it gives me something to engage my interest.
right. Well, I think there's a balance. I mean, when you're listening to a podcast and you're learning new things, you are stimulating your brain as well. Maybe have some time. Maybe you have another way in your life to have a meditative or mindful component than your walk. The beauty of an individualized approach is just to help people figure out what things work for them. And so in our study with the heart math, in my first study, I had a wonderful rabbi, and he said, I don't like this heart math. I don't like it. When I say my prayers and my chants, that's mindfulness for me. I go, yes, it is. That's great. And as soon as the study's over, you can lose the heart math and just do that. But for the purposes of a study, we have to ask people to all have similar interventions. So on to the brain training for more neuroplasticity. We use a program called Brain HQ. Brain HQ, brain games, basically. We're well beyond doing crossword puzzles for the brain, which can still help your brain. Anything that you're learning and thinking and processing is stimulating your brain. Listening to music is stimulating your brain. Dancing is excellent for the brain, and they have nice data with dancing and dementia, especially partners dancing. The best results came with Argentine tango, which I have danced for many years, so I was happy about.
Well, I am terrible at Latin American music, so that's bad news for me.
And you know what? If you don't like the music, then that won't be a good stimulation for your brain.
Well, I remember when I was with some friends and we were being taught how to do the merengue. I was terrible.
Yeah, so it's not for you. But you know what? There's lots of different kinds of dancing. I tell people, put on some music in your kitchen and crank it up and dance around some happy music and jump around. And the hormonal releases and benefits just from jumping around and singing and dancing are beautiful. So it doesn't have to be anything particular. The Brain HQ has done all kinds of outcome research with their brain games, and they keep evolving it. In the studies, there's different domains of games that they're playing to stimulate different functions in the brain. So some for memory, some for navigation, some for hearing, some for processing speed. As you get better, the games get harder. It keeps upping the ante, so people get better and better. And then we were able to track how much better did they get. And they all got better from what they were able to do with this. I know the patient of mine that was the most impaired, and this particular patient has 2 copies of the ApoE4 allele, and we could say some more about genetics in a minute, but
Sure.
he was very impaired. When he came into the study, pretty much all he could do was exercise and do Brain HQ. And so he did 2 or 3 times more time on the brain games than anybody else. I think we asked people to do about 12 minutes a day on this, and he did lots of it because that was something he could do. It was amazing how much he improved. So that is another thing that we incorporate. And Brain HQ, you can put it on your cell phone, so you can have it with you all the time. If you're waiting for a doctor's appointment and it's going to be a while, you can sit there and play some games on your cell phone.
And there's a variety of tests you do, and you just touched on genetics. Genetics isn't destiny, but it does stack the odds in some people's favor and less in others.
Yeah, so definitely, first off, the message is that genetics doesn't equal destiny. And just because you have the ApoE4 gene, it doesn't mean that.
Which is a gene which makes it more likely that you will develop dementia.
It does confer an increased risk. But these days, we are so far now beyond ApoE4 because there's other genes that we've learned about that can intensify your risk or can lower your risk, take your risk almost to the same as an ApoE3 person.
Well, perhaps we should break down what the different Apo gene configurations mean.
Yeah.
Would you mind just explaining that?
Yeah, so there's 3 different forms. There's ApoE2, E3, and E4. So the risk of getting dementia does increase with an ApoE4 gene. And if you have 2 copies, so if you get one from each parent, it is going to be a much higher risk. And what I tell people, because I work with people that have 2 copies of E4 that have come for prevention, like their parents might have had Alzheimer's and they don't want to get it. And you just have to try harder to do all of these things right. I mean, obviously, the more we can prevent these things by our diet, exercise, sleep, stress, lifestyle choices, keeping our blood sugar good and our blood pressure and lipids good, then these are all things that will help to prevent this disorder from coming. But when you have an ApoE4 gene, what happens is kind of part of the amyloid story. So ApoE4 people will make more amyloid from an injury than people who are ApoE3. So if a 3 and a 4 both get an infection in their brain like herpes, ApoE4 is going to make more amyloid.
Super sensitive, so it sort of overreacts.
Yes. And then the ApoE4 also is called the fat bucket gene. And people with ApoE4 tend to store their dietary fats more in their blood vessels in their body. So you have to watch what happens with the lipids, with the ApoE4s. And some people say that you shouldn't do a ketogenic diet with an ApoE4 because they're already having problems, perhaps with the lipids. I say that is an individual story because we use a ketogenic diet in the study, so everybody's going to do it irregardless. And then I follow their advanced lipid markers, and I test them always at the beginning to understand who needs help with their lipids. And then I test it again at 3 months. And what I have repeatedly seen in a lot of my patients is even with a high-fat diet, their lipids are going down. And it's because doing all kinds of things to reduce inflammation. They're eating clean fats and clean diet and exercising and sleeping. Now, does that happen for everybody? No. Occasionally they will go up, It can be even in an ApoE3. It doesn't have to be ApoE4. But then I'll have to advise people that we need to cut out a lot of the saturated fats, like from coconut and, some of the meat, and then use more olive oil and things with less saturated fat. So I don't see ApoE4 as a barrier to doing a ketogenic diet, but it is a higher risk. We do these advanced genetic panels from a company called Intellx DNA, INTELLXX DNA. This is pretty much Cadillac genetics. Unfortunately, it's quite expensive. The benefit of the testing we get from them is they also tell us what are the epigenetic factors that can turn this gene on or off. So if we need to not have that gene express as well, what can we do? Or if we need to make it express more, what can we do? From that, I've learned, and I have a list of all kinds of different variants that will change the risk. I mean, there's one called Tom40. And if you have that in addition to E4, that's going to increase your risk. But if you don't have it, it lowers your risk of an E4. There's multiple variants like this now that we're learning about. So ApoE4 is not the whole story, but you do have to try a little harder, especially if you have 2 copies of E4.
What's the difference in your risk if you've got ApoE2 and ApoE3?
The 3s tend not to detoxify as well. So that becomes an issue if we're accumulating toxins that can affect the brain and the body. The 2 is an interesting one. The 2 is very rare. It's not super common. E2 is somewhat protective and might actually decrease the dementia risk. Sometimes you have a 2-4. So you have your 2 that's protective. You have your 4 that increases your risk.
The one cancels the other out.
Yeah. The beauty is there's a lot of redundancy in the genetic code. There's one variant I should mention with the genetics that we get in this testing, a variant called BCHE K variant. And when you have this variant, if it's negative, it cuts your risk in half. But if it's positive, it doubles your risk. So it's an important thing to know, but it's most important to know because when you have that variant, if you take a cholinesterase medication like Aricept for dementia, it will hasten your decline. You will decline faster if you have this variant. So people that have this variant should not be taking the cholinesterase medications.
Do you think anybody should be?
Do I think anybody should be? So Aricept can slow the decline by about a year, is what we showed in the earlier studies. I did those studies. And so it slows things down. It just doesn't fix the underlying cause. So it will keep going. And then after a year, it's kind of like all the benefits are gone. But it can help some people. And one thing I would say is when people are on it, and they decide, okay, it's no longer helping, it still should be tapered off slowly. Because if you stop it abruptly, you can suddenly see a decline. I tend not to use this because I have a lot of other tools that I can use to help people get better without the medication. Now, the newer medications scare me. The anti-amyloid antibody medications that have come out, the risk of having a brain bleed from the medications is 24%.
And these can be catastrophic brain bleeds.
Yes, there have been fatalities with every single one of those medications. So not all the brain bleeds cause you to die, but having a bleed in your brain is still destructive. It's not a good thing.
I mean, if you've already got cognitive functioning problems, then you have a major brain bleed.
Right.
It's certainly not going to improve your cognitive function.
Right. And then with other downsides of the cost is $35,000, $40,000 a year. You have to go for infusions. But if they worked, people would pay that. But kind of what they've mostly shown is they slow the decline for 4 to 6 months with a 24% risk of brain bleed. So to my mind, that's not the solution that people should be doing.
And one thing that you think is really important to test for, Kat, and that is toxins and infections.
Yeah. So let's start with the infections. Because COVID has really taught us a lot about the effect of a virus on the brain. And in my world, we were testing all kinds of viruses and infections that affect the brain even before COVID. Traditional medicine doesn't really have a lot of good treatments for viruses. We're just taught, oh, they run their course and you don't really do anything for most of them. But what we've learned from COVID is we know COVID attacks the heart, the blood vessels, and the brain. And so many people develop major brain fog after having COVID, and some people after COVID vaccines as well. So the vaccine is triggering the immune response similar to what COVID triggers in the body. It's kind of put brain fog as a term into the vernacular. Not everybody knew what that was before, but it really just means this like sluggish, foggy brain, and it's just not functioning well. And some people get frank dementia from COVID, including younger people. A friend of mine that's a neurologist has a whole cohort of young people that have come to her with frank dementia symptoms after COVID. So basically, this is showing us virus causes brain problems. It's been known for, 20, 30 years, the effects of herpes in the brain. Herpes simplex 1 is the cold sores. Close to 90% of people get this in childhood. When we have viruses, typically they integrate into our body and the immune system tamps them down and they don't cause problems until we have problems with impaired immunity, which can happen with aging. It can happen with stress, can happen with surgery, and different things can cause these viruses to reactivate. So an autopsy study on people who died with Alzheimer's found that 99% of them had high levels of herpes in their brain. Now, it doesn't say that the herpes caused the Alzheimer's, but it's probably one of many factors, knowing that it gets in the brain. And when there's an infection there, that activates the immune system. And the immune system, to kill infections, causes inflammation, releases cytokines that can be destructive. So there was an interesting study out of Taiwan. They looked at over 30,000 people that had herpes infections, and they found that if you took a single course of an antiviral medication for herpes, it decreased your risk of getting dementia 10 times. So I have a long list, 2 pages long, of infections that I've found that affect the brain, but I'm kind of going after the ones that are more common. When I find herpes, I will put people on the antiviral medication, valacyclovir, acyclovir. The question is how long to treat them, and I don't know the answer. We don't have the data for that. Columbia University was starting a study that I think got canceled because of COVID, and they were using valacyclovir to treat Alzheimer's. So they were only doing that, which I don't think will be sufficient, but they were giving it for 18 months in this trial. And Stanford had another trial that was using an antiviral for 18 months for chronic fatigue syndrome, which is also felt to be in part due to infections and viruses. So I will follow the antibody levels in people, and I'm generally treating people for 6 to 12 months. The medicines are not very expensive. They're not very toxic. They are broken down by the kidneys. So I just make sure that people's kidney function is good. There's a few other studies showing the benefits of treatment with that. Lyme disease is a biggie, and Lyme disease is increasing in prevalence and incidence everywhere because of global warming, and the ticks are thriving with the global warming. Where I live in California now, Lyme disease has been found in every county here in California and seem to originate up in the Northeast, where the heaviest levels are the Northeast and then over into Minnesota. But it's all over the country.
And even in West London, we have it.
Yeah, and there's different strains. So one of the companies that we use for testing will test the US strains, the European strains, and the Asian strains. And my baby sister came up positive for the European strains and the Asian strains. And her doctor said, well, this must be a mistake. And my sister said, no, I was career Army. And, I lived in Asia, I lived in Europe. And the dilemma has been, how do we get adequate testing that will test all these variants? Because our main labs here that we use in medicine are Quest and LabCorp, and they only test one strain. And furthermore, when you do Lyme testing, they look at something called bands. And the bands, they put the sample on an electrophoretic gel and they apply a current, and different proteins in the blood related to this infection will migrate at different rates. And then they stain the bands and they say you have band 41, you have band 23, different bands. Well, there were some of those bands were affected by the Lyme vaccine. And so, in all of its infinite wisdom, which I'm saying sarcastically, our labs threw out all the bands that were impacted by the Lyme vaccine. Well, that vaccine was only around a short time. Not very many people took it. And so we cannot rely on our testing from Quest and LabCorp, which means specialty labs, which means a larger cost because it's not covered on their insurance all the time. Lyme is a spirochete. Syphilis is a spirochete. Now, syphilis has always been part of a dementia workup. We know that before we had antibiotics, men would get a sexually transmitted disease and it would seem to go away, but then they would go crazy down the road and they would get demented from the syphilis infection in their brain. Well, Lyme disease is very similar to syphilis. It's the same kind of microorganisms, a spirochete, as I mentioned. So sometimes you won't know unless you test. And I have discovered evidence of Lyme disease in people that say, well, I don't have a dog. I'm not an outdoors person. I've never had any tick bites, but they still clearly have evidence that they had it. And then some of the further testing can help us to determine, is it active?
The traditional view of Lyme's disease is if it's not treated, the patient develops various neurological symptoms, which then become very serious. But what you're suggesting is, for some people at least, it becomes a sort of long-term chronic condition.
If it's untreated and it's replicating in the brain, it's causing problems. There was a case report of a woman who had known Lyme disease. She was treated appropriately with antibiotics. They said she was fine. She went on to become demented. They did an autopsy and they found live spirochetes in her brain. So the treatment didn't work, and that Lyme disease was still replicating in her brain.
And what's scary is you're saying that actually, unless you have the appropriate testing, you may test negative when in fact you do have the disease.
Yes. Yes. So we have a company in the US called iGenix, and they test all the bands and they test all those different strains that I mentioned. And again, the barrier has been the cost. But I think they're finally getting the message because they just started releasing some direct to consumer testing at lower cost. There's another company that I think you can get some testing from in the UK that we have here as well, called Infectolab. And Infectolab does what's called T-cell testing. And if you have an infection, be it a virus, Lyme disease, when you have an infection, the T cells should be reacting to fight that infection. And once the infection is cleared, the T cell response should die down in 4 to 8 weeks. So sometimes I'll use that testing also to know, what is my endpoint of treatment? Has the person cleared this disease? But it is a way you can also test for Lyme. And if your T cells are reacting to Lyme, you can be sure you're having some active infection there in your body.
Toxins are something else that can be contributive to dementia too.
Yeah, right. So mercury, right, is a big one. We've known from the old days of the saying, mad as a hatter, came from people that worked making hats, and they make the felt to make the hats. And they used to process that with mercury, and they all became mad from the mercury. So we know that heavy metals can accumulate in the brain. Lead is another one, of course, well known. Children that are exposed to lead have much lower IQs and other neurologic problems at times. So testing for the burden of heavy metals in our body is important. And there are things we can do to lower those. I mean, I find high mercury much more commonly than high lead because of how polluted all of our oceans and rivers have become. But with high lead, if you do find that and you treat and do chelation protocols to lower that lead, sometimes you'll see people's cognition improve quite dramatically. But the mercury, so many of my patients are coming high in mercury, but there's different levels of high. So our labs here in the US say, okay, it's positive if it's over 4. But to me, you shouldn't have any in your body and your brain. And if it's over 1, I think it's a problem.
Because lots of people have got mercury from their tooth fillings.
Yeah. And as those fillings break down with age, they start leaking the mercury into your body. Also, if you drink hot liquids, that can vaporize the mercury. If you brush too vigorously over the mercury fillings, that can cause vaporization as well. And it's those vapors of the mercury that travel up through the back of your nose into your brain that cause the problems. So I definitely recommend getting rid of mercury fillings, but it's not the first thing that I do, because first I need to make sure that people are detoxifying well, that their guts are working, that they get healthy so that their body can withstand even getting rid of them. I always recommend that people see a biologic dentist that knows how to safely take out the mercury fillings. But even bigger than the fillings is the fish and the seafood. And I've had people that tell me, well, I only eat wild caught salmon, and that is supposed to be low mercury, but they still have high mercury. It's not that hard to get rid of that high mercury for people that are getting it from the seafood. What I do is I ask them to stop all seafood for 3 to 6 months, depends on how high the level is. I put them on broccoli extract, sulforaphane, that helps to support detox. And I have a favorite one that's got research data, and they say it upregulates 200 phase 2 detox liver enzymes. So very helpful. And I know that some of their data is in schizophrenia and autism. So I know it's directly helping the brain. That one is called Avmacol, Avmacol. And so I'll put them on the Avmacol and avoid the seafood, and then ask them, if possible, to do treatments with sauna. And the sauna and the sweating, we have nice data showing that you do get rid of heavy metals and chemical toxins through your sweat. So I give people the caveat that when they're doing sauna, or if they're doing hot yoga or some exercise with heavy sweating, you want to wipe off the sweat as it occurs. And then as soon as you're done, you want to go and jump in the shower and use soap and wipe off those toxins. Otherwise, you can reabsorb them back into your body. So I had a patient early on who came to me. She was already in a nursing home for dementia, so she was pretty far along. Biggest thing that I felt like I turned up was her toxic burden. There's 2 labs that'll test chemical toxins, Mosaic Labs, which is available in the UK, I know, and Real Time Labs, which I don't know if it's available there. They say if you have like 1 chemical in the red or 2 in the yellow, that's a significant toxic burden. But this woman had 8 things in the red. And then you think, well, what did she do? How did she get exposed to all these chemicals? Right. And there's some occupations, people that work in the chemical industry or the oil field, or crop dusters spraying chemicals. Hairdressers are another one. Hairdressers that are doing hair color get exposed to a lot of toxins. In her case, she was a school teacher, and her daughter said, my parents were always into health. We always ate healthy and lived a clean lifestyle. So what did that tell me? It told me that she was a poor detoxifier, that her genetics just meant that she did not detoxify well, because we all get exposed to a lot of chemicals, but some of us detoxify those chemicals better than others. And I suggested to her daughter that she get tested. And sure enough, her daughter, who was not sick at that time, had pretty high levels. And now I'm trying to figure out, how can we test for the plastics? The microplastics is the latest big bad thing that we find that we're all getting exposed to. Even the lining of the paper cups, like at Starbucks, that lining is releasing a heavy burden of plastics when you drink that. It's a huge problem. Our world has become increasingly toxic, and we all have to try to figure out ways to help it and to protect ourselves from those toxins, because they do accumulate in the brain.
And I will, on our podcast show notes, put your website details with the protocol and the various tests and things that you do. And I know we can't go into all of them just now, but I know one of the big ones that you mentioned is hormones.
Right, right. Hormones is such an important area for the brain. And it turns out that the brain has receptors for all of these hormones. Men and women have estrogen receptors in the brain. Men and women have testosterone receptors in the brain. Men and women have progesterone receptors. We also have receptors for pregnenolone and DHEA, which are all part of this hormone cascade. And actually, all of these things that we think of as sex hormones start from cholesterol. So when you look at the diagram, cholesterol turns into pregnenolone, and then pregnenolone goes on to turn into estrogen and testosterone and progesterone and DHEA, and then turns into the thyroid hormones and the stress hormones. Cholesterol is a fat. It's been a problem in our lifetime that we were all taught to eat low fat and then enter in the statin medications to further lower our fats and lipid levels. And that, for some people, is killing their brains. So when the cholesterol is too low, it cannot support these hormones, and it can't even support your structure in your brain because the brain is mostly fat. And then the myelin sheaths that surround each nerve that help to conduct the impulses down your nerves is made out of fat. And so when we don't have enough fat in our diets, the brain is not going to function and the hormones aren't going to function. So some of my most impaired people psychiatrically are people that genetically have very low cholesterol levels, and we're trying to change their diet to increase those healthy fats to get the cholesterol up. So back to those hormones and the receptors in the brain, these hormones are so important for the brain that it makes its own supply of estrogen and testosterone. So we think of those as being made from the sexual organs, but it's also made in the brain. And that should give some protection after menopause and andropause. Andropause is the corollary with men. If they lose their hormones, men lose them a lot more slowly than women. Women, we lose them abruptly. It's suddenly gone. Well, it's a 10-year process of us losing them, but then once it happens, they're gone. So we have these additional supplies being made in our brain to protect us after menopause and andropause. But as you and I have just discussed, there's all these toxins and infections that are disrupting our brains. The brain may not be getting enough. And so one of the things that we found is that replacing all these hormones can greatly enhance their cognitive function for many people. And there was a study that Stanford did a few years ago, and they took women that had been on hormone replacement and that had a high risk for Alzheimer's. And they randomized them to either stay on their hormones or stop their hormones. And they followed them for 2 years. And they did neuropsych testing and they did head scans. And they found that 100% of the women who stopped their hormones had degeneration in their brains as compared to the women that stayed on them. In that study, it didn't separate out the old hormones, the synthetic chemicals like Premarin and Provera versus the bioidentical hormones that we use these days.
Which are thought to be safer.
Right. They're thought to be, they are safer. They're much safer. They don't cause cancer. They don't cause blood clots, but the oral estrogen that we used to use does. So I will not even work with somebody if they are taking oral estrogen. I think it's so dangerous. So we give the estrogen transdermally through the skin in a patch or a cream. And that avoids the first pass metabolism in the liver that creates these metabolites that can lead to cancer, and also the inflammation that's activated that increases the clotting risk for strokes. One of the early things that I see with cognitive decline in women is word finding difficulty. They have trouble finding the right word, and they say, oh, it's on the tip of my tongue and I can't get it. I mean, we all have moments like this, but it becomes quite a pattern for some people. I remember going to my doctor when I turned 50 and I was having a lot of cognitive problems. And I said, I'm having this word finding problem, and I'm also saying the wrong word. I'll want to say, open the door, please. And I'll say, open the window. And my doctor said, oh, this is a hallmark of perimenopause. We see it all the time. Okay, I felt comforted for 10 minutes. And then I started to think about it. I said, well, wait a minute. Okay, as a woman, we have a 50% risk of getting dementia. And what if those of us that have these cognitive problems as we lose our hormones are going to be the ones that get dementia? So as part of the work that we do, we replace all these hormones. We don't put somebody to the level of a 20 to 30-year-old, but we want to have enough of a level to provide their brain with the support that they need. And estrogen in the brain actually shuttles glucose into the brain and oxygen. Like there's all these marvelous things that estrogen does in the brain. Progesterone is another fascinating brain chemical. If you have a traumatic brain injury, there's really nice data for men and women to take high dose progesterone, especially the first couple of days, but even a couple of weeks. There's much better recovery from head trauma with high dose progesterone.
And would you be giving the women testosterone as well?
Yeah, if it's low for the testosterone in women, try to replace it to about the middle of the range. And I don't need them at the high end of the range. It's very difficult because we don't have any commercial pharmaceutical preparations for women with testosterone. They've just ignored that, but we can get it from compounding pharmacies. And I use a compounding pharmacy out of Colorado, Belmar Compounding Pharmacy, and they will make testosterone for women in these little tiny tablets. And the woman can just pop in the tablet vaginally at bedtime and get nice absorption there and nice testosterone uptake.
In the UK, there's Australian testosterone cream that people can get privately, but not on the NHS.
Yeah, I like getting it in the little tablet because it's not messy. When you put the cream on in women, the testosterone will make the hair grow. And so suddenly you can find hair growing in the groin or places where you didn't have so much before. So that is a drawback with that. Many women, when they're aging, still have enough testosterone. That one is, I have to test it and see. And half of my patients don't need it and half of them do. And the testosterone is a really interesting brain hormone. It's a great antidepressant. It increases the dopamine levels in the brain, which help our attention and motivation and interest in things. So it's got a lot of other functions beyond the sexual functioning aspect. And I'm seeing low testosterone in men at younger and younger ages. And I think it's, again, because of disruption from toxins, and we haven't even gotten into mold and mycotoxins, but both mycotoxins and Lyme in younger men can really disrupt their testosterone production.
So for men too, you might have to increase their hormone levels if they're showing early signs.
Yeah.
And would that just be testosterone, or would there be other hormones you would be giving men too?
Well, we don't give them estrogen because the testosterone turns into estrogen. There is a level of estrogen that's important for men, and it should be 20 to 30 in our American measurements. If I see the estrogen low, that actually correlates with more cognitive decline and other problems. But if I give a man testosterone, I will see those estrogen levels come up. I actually follow them because I don't want them to come up too high. And typically, we don't give men progesterone. Again, if there's head trauma, that would be a situation that I might consider it. And then I do replace pregnenolone and DHEA in everyone. And pregnenolone and DHEA, they're like the beginning of the hormone cascade, cholesterol to pregnenolone, and pregnenolone turns into all these sex hormones. Then DHEA actually comes in the cascade just before testosterone. So some people say if you give DHEA, it can raise the testosterone. I haven't seen that happen too reliably in my patients, but I have colleagues that say it happens in theirs. And it would make sense that it could. So interestingly, estrogen is a prescription medication. Testosterone is actually a controlled substance because people can abuse it for the bodybuilding. But pregnenolone and DHEA are not prescription medications, and you get those as a supplement. But I don't recommend taking pregnenolone and DHEA unless your levels are low. All these hormones have a sweet spot. You don't want too little, but you don't want too much.
That's interesting because there's been quite a debate in the UK about giving women higher levels of estradiol for women who are poor absorbers. And it seems to be quite controversial. Some medics think it's the right thing to do. Others argue you shouldn't really ever go beyond a certain point.
Well, I do have some women that don't absorb that well through their skin. With the estrogen patches, which are my favorite because it's a very steady state delivery, I have some of them that have to put on 1.5 patches of the highest dose. Even some, I've had 1 or 2 that had to put on 2 in order to get a level. But what I do then is I will check their hormone metabolites. So there are some specialty tests, several different companies that will break down the levels and tell you, okay, here's all their estrogen metabolites. Maybe their metabolites are coming really high, in which case they don't need such a high dose. So there's a way to check that. But normally we'll just go on the blood level because that's validated and commercially available. There's more research needed, like what is really an optimal level? Because typically nobody gave hormones to women long after menopause. As soon as the hot flashes were over, they said, well, you don't need it anymore. Well, unfortunately, your brain still needs it. With the maximum life expectancies going for a lot of people above 90 now, that gives you like 40 years after menopause. It is very important that we figure out how to maintain the integrity of these hormones so that we can live healthy and strong and keep our brains, but also the estrogen is critical for your cardiac function and your bones. As soon as women lose their estrogen, their risk for heart disease starts to come almost to the level of a man. The issues for the bones are huge. And I have a couple people that recently this year have finally started on estrogen. One had osteoporosis, and I kept saying, you're just swimming upstream without a paddle if you don't go on estrogen. Finally, the doctors wanted to give her the big infusions of bisphosphonates that she didn't want to take. So she said, I'll do it.
Quite problematic drugs in terms of the atypical fractures people could end up with.
Well, exactly. They increase the bone density on DEXA, but they don't necessarily increase the tensile strength of the bone. So the important thing is the outcome. What does it do for changing the outcome? A lot of people don't believe that taking the hormones is going to change things, but it sure does. And this particular patient of mine, we just did all of her bone markers. She's no longer losing bone actively like she was before. And there's a newer test now, just did on myself, and it's called REMS Echolite. And it's an ultrasound method to measure the bone density, but they also give you a fragility score. And maybe your bone density isn't great, but your fragility score is really good. So the bone that you do have is strong. I had a young man in his 40s that was having a lot of psychiatric problems, and it turned out to be from Lyme and mold exposure. And his testosterone was very low. And so I put him on testosterone, and a little spidey sense in my head said, check his bone density. And I actually had never checked a man's bone density before. Checked his bone density. This guy had frank osteoporosis in his 40s. When men lose their hormones, their bones go as well.
Okay, we started off talking about some of the results you'd had in the trial where you saw the improvement on the MRI scans. In terms of the practical, everyday cognitive functions of these patients, what improvements did you see there?
Yeah. In the cognitive measures that we did on the MoCA and the CNS vital signs, we had statistically relevant improvement at 3 months and more at 6 months and then slightly more at 9 months. So the bulk of the improvement actually happened in the first 6 months with fixing everything at once. But the more important thing are the stories of people, right? And how that translates of getting their lives back. And our current study, we're doing at 6 locations, 72 patients to be enrolled. I think we're somewhere above 60 at this point. It's a randomized trial. So we have 2/3 of the patients getting our active precision medicine, functional medicine treatment, and 1/3 of the patients are getting what we call standard of care neurology. So we said, well, we'll do whatever a regular neurologist does, which is at this early phase, they kind of say, okay, come back in a year and we'll see how much worse you've gotten. That's the standard approach. And so basically we ask those patients in that cohort to agree not to make any major changes in their supplements, their exercise, their diet, those kind of things. Obviously, if something comes up health-wise, then they would treat it. We're looking at the difference between these two groups. And then the people who have we call it delayed treatment as well as standard of care. So we have funding that when they finish that in the 9-month trial, we give them 6 months of active treatment that the same as what we give the people that were in the active treatment phase. So they still get rewarded for doing this. In this study, quite a few of my patients have finished, and they're right in the front of my head since I'm seeing them now. So I can tell you some of their stories. It's amazing. I have all these patients, a lot of them in their mid 70s, who gone back to work. I have one patient who is starting a nonprofit, and this guy couldn't do anything before. I have a woman who's 76. She just learned to do Excel so that she could track all her supplements on Excel, taking over, fixing all kind of things around the house and doing things. And patient that a fine artist, and she was awarded a big exhibition in San Francisco to create all of these paintings, a lot of work. She wasn't even painting when she came into this study. So people getting their lives back, and then even taking things farther. Oh, another one that was semi-retired, and suddenly he's like, oh, I'm so busy. I have a contract from Stanford and a contract from so-and-so to do this and this and this. Like, these people are getting their lives back. And when I look at my current cohort, their MOCA scores, that's a 30-point scale. And below 26 is MCI. And then around 18, 19 is mild Alzheimer's.
And for those that don't know what MCI is,
mild cognitive impairment. Very large percentage of people with MCI will go on into frank dementia over the next year or two. So it's just a milder phase. And there's actually another term that we use called SCI, or subjective cognitive impairment. And that's the first phase, just when you think you have problems. And maybe you're not testing abnormally, but you think you have problems. And I always say, please listen to that, because when you think you're having problems, you are. And that's your window of opportunity to do something before things get bad. In my current patients, and they had MOCA scores all the way down to 19. The lady who learned to do Excel, she started at a 19 and she finished at a 28, which is perfectly normal. All my patients so far, they may still have some impairment. I'm not going to say that they're all 100% normal, but every single one of them in their testing that's finished so far has tested in the normal range. Doing this not only changes people's test scores, but they regain so much function back in their lives, and also in their general health. The autoimmune disease, the joint problems, people's inflammation go down, their blood sugar goes down, their blood pressure goes down, their lipids get better. It's going to improve all of their longevity as well. But I do want to say that they have to keep walking the walk.
They're not cured. They've got to keep doing the same things.
Yeah, because otherwise they still have risks if they go back to their same lifestyle. Or I've seen the people to say, well, I'm not going to do this and I'm not going to do that, or I don't want to take the hormones, or I don't want to, worry about my diet. And I have seen people get bad again.
But I suppose potentially a hurdle with rolling out this treatment to wider groups of patients, it can't be cheap because the number of different things you're doing. So, for example, here in Great Britain, where we have our National Health Service, how does one do this in a way which is economic?
That is a $1 million question. And my hope is that after we get the data from this study, if it's, even half as good as our first study, that we could get more uptake from institutions. Because I feel like if we could implement this in an institutional level, like Kaiser or the Veterans Administration or the National Health Service, there can be economy of scale. Obviously, you have to individualize the treatment based on what comes up, but I do think there could be ways to do it more economically for people. I'm always trying to figure out how can you do things for free? Like, there's a lot of great exercise programs that you can do for free online, right? There's great meditation programs for free online and YouTube, those kind of things. But the testing just has to be done. We have to have a way to implement the testing and to get it in the first place. I've been working with Quest Lab, one of our big labs here, trying to convince them to offer a direct-to-consumer test that's a giant panel. And it won't be cheap, but it would cover the bulk of the things that I test with infections and hormones and nutrient levels, the various things that are so important. Because if we can get the testing, that gives me the treatment targets. that tells me, okay, we need to work on this and this and this and this with you. But it gives me the treatment target. So that is such an important question. It's near and dear to my heart. I really hope that we can get some uptake from institutional programs because, yes, we want this available to everyone, and it's not.
And final question, is it also a political issue? Because it seems dementia societies around the world, many doctors would still see dementia as a single cause disease rather than a multi-system disease.
Right. Well, the political issue comes from within the funding for dementia research, which bulk of funding these days coming from the pharmaceutical industry. So it's not advantageous for the pharmaceutical industry to be looking at the other multimodal treatment approaches because their goal and their promise to their shareholders is to sell a drug to make the money from the drug. And some of these drugs could be potentially useful once we get rid of the underlying causes. If we can get rid of what's driving, say, the amyloid production and then take a medication to get rid of the amyloid, that might be useful, but just getting rid of the amyloid we know isn't useful. But I do think it comes down to the pharmaceutical industry, which funds the Alzheimer's Association. A bulk of their funding comes from the pharmaceutical industry. And Alzheimer's Association basically won't give the time of day to the kind of work we're doing. I do think it's a political problem driven by the funding sources for the medications.
Well, Kat, thank you so much for talking today. Such an interesting area of research. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, because I really want people to know that so many things they can do. Once people believe that we can reverse it, they might work harder at preventing it in the first place. Obviously, both are important, but thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much, Kat. Goodbye.
Okay, Liz. Bye.
Hope you enjoyed the latest episode of the podcast. And if you've enjoyed the podcast, if you could share it and leave a review on Spotify and Apple, I'd much appreciate it. It really helps. Many thanks for listening. Bye for now.